When it comes to the best pre-made Yu-Gi-Oh products, structure decks are often some of the best you can buy. Advertised as being playable right out of the box. In truth, often you actually need 3 of them, but we'll talk about that later. These decks are often a great way for players to build their first semi-competitive decks, as well as being a great way to provide much needed reprints to more experienced players. In this series, I'm going to take a look at each of these decks in chronological order and evaluate how well they perform in 3 categories: how playable it is out of the box, how good it is once being upgraded, and how many good reprints did the deck provide. Welcome to Structure Deck Scrutiny. The first pair of structure decks were released on the 1st of January 2005 in the TCG, and focused on 2 of the most popular archetypes in the game at the time, dragons and zombies. One of these decks was a real game changer in terms of Yu-Gi-Oh, as it provided a cheap way for players to build a near complete Tier 1 deck. And this is not that one. Yes, while zombies were one of the best decks at the time, doing well in both the 2005 and in modern GOAT format, dragons didn't really find their footing as a deck until a lot later, and didn't really have much of a coherent playstyle. But let's see what this deck managed to scrape together anyway, shall we? Just to be clear, in these videos I'll be judging these decks in 3 different ways: how playable it is out of the box, how good the deck was once fully upgraded, and how good were the deck's reprints for building other decks. Because even if such a deck wasn't particularly good, there was always the possibility of them being a launch pad to build other decks if the cards were good enough. Now, when looking at the Dragon's Raw structure deck out of the box, the first problem, like I said, is that it doesn't have much of a coherent strategy beyond playing the most decent dragons that were available at the time. Looking at the main boss monster of the deck, Red Eye's Darkness Dragon, a monster that gains 300 points for every dragon in your graveyard, you'd think filling the grave full of dragons would be this deck's main goal, and we'd have ways to both dump cards and have more graveyard focused cards, right? Not really. Other than Red Eye's Black Chick and the 2-armed dragon monsters, there isn't much in the way of dumping dragons to the grave. In addition to this, other than Twin-Headed Behemoth and Graveyard in the 4th Dimension, which probably is the worst card in the deck, there isn't much in the way of graveyard synergy either. As such, Red Eye's Darkness Dragon is actually among the weakest cards in this deck, often being nothing more than a slightly upgraded Red Eyes, which is often a brick in the hand. Needless to say, this wasn't the way to play this deck back in the day, other than the most casual of settings, and this card's one of the first to be dropped when upgrading this deck. So with the graveyard strategy out, the other potential strategy a dragon deck could have is just simple beatdown. Dragons are usually fairly big monsters, so this is not unreasonable. However, again, this deck isn't that good in this aspect either. Firstly, the deck is surprisingly light on monsters at only 14, and many of them are one-offs. As such, even in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh, buying multiple structure decks, or at least a deck plus singles, was most of the time necessary. Secondly, most of the monsters in this deck are surprisingly puny. I'm assuming this is to work with Masked Dragon's recruiter ability, however it means the only level 4 or lower monster with more than 1500 attack in this deck is Luster Dragon. Other than this, we have an Elemental Dragon, which can be a 2k monster if we control the right attribute, but most of the time it's just a 1500 vanilla. Sure, we have Red Eyes cards and Armed Dragon level 5 as decent beaters, but this deck doesn't have nearly the required power or monster density to really be a good beatdown deck out of the box. So overall, when it comes to playability out of the box, I have to give Dragon's Roar a fail in this aspect, as it doesn't really excel in either strategy it tries to do. So we've established that this deck isn't that good right out of the box, but could it be salvaged if we upgraded it with cards available at the time? In my view, there are 2 main ways one can upgrade this deck while still staying true to the theme: Dragon Beatdown or Armed Dragon Turbo. Beginning with Dragon Beatdown, I believe there are several changes that would have been very cheap that could be done. Firstly, we'll be upping the number of Luster Dragons to 3. This is by far the best normal swim for Dragon Beatdown, with its high stats of 1900, and it was also a very cheap pickup at the time. Adding on to this, we have another 1900 attack dragon I'm shocked wasn't in the precon, in Spear Dragon. What makes this card ideal for beatdown is that in addition to its large body, it also inflicts piercing damage, which was a very powerful effect in Yu-Gi-Oh at the time, as the game was dominated by a lot of flip monsters with low stats, like Magician of Faith and Magical Merchant, so hitting over those for 1500 per attack was pretty powerful. There was a downside to this card in that it changes to defense after attacking. However, if you want to get a quick win against a heavily defensive deck, then a PS like Spear Dragon should be an auto-include. Finally, in terms of normal summonable dragons, there was Mirage Dragon. While weaker than the other 2 I've mentioned, the 1600, Mirage has an ability that is invaluable to beatdown strategies. It prevents the opponent from activating traps during the battle phase. At this point in Yu-Gi-Oh, battle traps were abundant and played in almost every deck. Even at local level events where many players couldn't afford Mirror Force, cards like Sekaretsu Armor and Magic Cylinder were still very likely to see play, so having a card like Mirage that could shut all those powerful cards down and allow us to swing through without fear is one of the most powerful tools to give any aggro deck. Throw in a few more non-dragon beaters, like Breaker the Magical Warrior, add most of the spells that came with this deck, I'll talk about those in the next section, and if you could get them back then, some traps like Ring of Destruction, Sakaretsu Armor, and maybe Mirror Force, and you had a decently competitive deck for at least the local level at the time period. The other option a player had at the time to upgrade this deck was going full on the Armed Dragon cards. In this variant of the deck, we're going to up the number of Armed Dragon level 3 and 5s to 3 and add in 1 or 2 copies of Armed Dragon level 7. The aim of this deck would be to get out one of these higher level dragons and use their removal effects to control the opponent's field while protecting our boss monsters with our spells and traps. The deck would also include the 3 Masked Dragons from the Precon and supplement them with 3 Sangans and possibly Flying Kamakuris in order to maximise the chances of seeing an Armed Dragon level 3 turn 1, so we can quickly level them up into level 5 on turn 2. From there we'll either go up into level 7 next turn or stick with level 5 and use the card's destruction abilities and large bodies to keep the opponent's field monster free, while using cards like Sakaretsu Armor, Book of Moon and My Body's a Shield to protect the dragons. While this deck would have also been mostly a casual deck back in the day, at the very least it would have had some potential at local level. So looking at the few ways we have to upgrade this deck, we can see there are a couple of ways to improve on what was in the Precon, and this deck can provide players with an okay at best leveled locals deck. However, I don't see any way this deck could be upgraded beyond a local level, but that has more to do with the lack of power dragons had as a whole at the time. As we'll see in the next section, this deck did provide another way for players to begin a competitive deck. So in this category, I'm going to give dragons a half pass on upgradability. For the final part of this video, we're going to take a look at the one aspect that can make even the worst structure deck somewhat worth getting, the reprints. Oftentimes when certain cards have either become too expensive, or more likely, Konami know they can't make any more money selling a particular set, they will often mass release these cards to the public as part of their current structure deck of the time. We saw this recently with Albaz, with the previously £80 to £100 Pot of Extravagance being reprinted, along with staples like Dark Rule no more. And let's be honest, the only reason most players cared about the Cyberdark structure deck was the Infinite Impermanence reprint. So how well did this deck do in this aspect? Was this deck worth getting back in 05 for someone looking for competitive cards to beef up other decks? Honestly, yes, sort of. As while in my view there isn't much of a way of a competitive deck here, the reprints, especially in the spells, did provide a good starting point for one. Sadly, we don't start out too strongly here, because in terms of monsters there was only one useful one in Twin-Headed Behemoth, a level 4 1500 attack dragon that upon being destroyed can be sent back at the end phase with 1000 attack and defense. While not amazing, this card was a decent choice in some Monarch decks and a few beatdown strategies. However, the meat of the good reprints in this deck definitely comes from the spell and traps. First up was Pot of Greed, which was pretty much played in every single deck at the time and probably would be today if it was not banned, which made a common reprint that flooded the market with them a very welcome addition. Although this wasn't the first common reprint of the card, having seen a reprint inside the deck Yugi Evolution, it was such a highly needed card at the time that more reprints were definitely welcome. Although I will say in terms of card draw, I'm surprised this deck also didn't reprint Graceful Charity. As I said, this deck wants you to fill up the grave with Dragons for Darkness, so you'd think a card that let you dump 2 of them would be a good fit for the deck. Oh well. Adding on to this, we had 2 powerful equip cards that were pretty much played in every single deck at the time, in Premature Burial and Snatch Steal. With Change of Heart and Monster Reborn already banned at this time, this deck gave players easy access to the cards that would be their replacement for a while. Snatch Steal in particular was pretty powerful, as it being an equip meant you could keep control of the monster for longer if you wanted, as opposed to either having to tribute or give it back at the end of turn, like with Change of Heart, and it could also be bounced back to the hand for repeated uses with cards like Giant Trunade. Premature Burial was just a powerful revival card back then, as like Monster Reborn it could be played the turn it was drawn, and its downside was very minimal. This was also another card in need of a reprint at the time, so that's another plus for this section. Next we've got a couple of staple removal cards. In number 1 I've Crossed Out for monsters, and MST and Heavy Storm for back row. Again, these cards are powerful staples at the time that saw play in nearly every deck, and for Heavy Storm this was the first time the card had seen a reprint to make it widely available, having only been an ultra rare in Metal Raiders 2.5 years ago at this point. We also got 2 other spells, one not being staples in every deck, still saw enough play to warrant a mention in Swords of Revealing Light and Creature Swap. Creature Swap in particular saw play in decks that used many recruiters, such as zombies, and some variants of Chaos decks, while Swords saw fringe play in some stall and burn strategies like Pac-Man and Burn. Overall, I'd definitely say the spell reprints would have been where players would have gotten their money's worth back in the day. Moving on to the traps, before I talk about that, can I just have a rant for a second? Why for nearly a decade were Konami so against reprinting Mirror Force? The card was literally a staple from the time it came out until the early 2010s, and the first time we got a Structure Deck reprint to make it widely available was Structure Deck Marek in 2010. Anyway, much like the monsters, it's slim pickings in terms of trap reprints, with only a couple of noteworthy mentions. First up we have Ceasefire, a normal trap that flips all face down monsters face up without triggering their effects, and then burns at a point for 500 for each of them. This card obviously sees play in many versions of gut format burn decks, and can also be a good side deck card against decks with a lot of flip monsters, which again were very popular at the time. The other good trap reprint in this deck was Call of the Haunted. Much like Premature Burial, this card was a staple at the time, with Monster Reborn being banned, and this deck was actually the first card printing, making it a much easier card to get at the time. Also, this is another card that wouldn't see another reprint till Fury from the Deep a year later, so for a short time this deck was the best way to pick this card up. Outside of these 2 cards, the only other reprint worth looking at is Reckless Greed, which allows us to draw 2 cards at the cost of skipping our next 2 draw phases. Not a card played too often, and certainly not something you'd ever want in a Dragon deck. This card nevertheless could have potentially seen play in decks like Burn and Exodia at the time. So I believe that they did a pretty good job in this deck in offering good reprints for the time, particularly in the spell department, and while this deck itself was never very competitive, a player who bought it definitely received some tools to build a competitive deck later down the line if they wished. In conclusion, of the original 2 structure decks, Dragon Draw is by far the weaker of the 2. The main weakness was the lack of synergy between most dragon monsters and the minimal support for what was meant to be the deck's main strategy. However, the deck does have an excellent selection of spell reprints with a few decent traps thrown in. Also for the time you could have at least made a decent locals level deck with a couple of these and a few extra cards. The deck's biggest fault, however, is the fact that unless you really liked dragons, there really wasn't much of a reason to pick this one up over the Zombie Madness deck. So overall, a fairly medium start to Structure Decks as a product, and I'm giving this deck a 5 out of 10. Thank you for watching, and join me next week when I review Zombie Madness and we see what a great Structure Deck for this time period looked like.